The town of Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled in a valley surrounded by lush, pine-covered hills, it was a picturesque escape from the chaos of nearby cities. The community was tight-knit, and most people spent their whole lives there, bound by tradition and familiarity. Among the town's prominent families was the Reynolds household, a family that had once seemed unshakable, but whose story would become a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Jonathan Reynolds was the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. At 6 feet tall, with a rugged build and a warm, confident smile, he exuded charisma. People gravitated to him, not just for his looks, but for the way he could command a room with his voice, deep and steady like a river. A natural leader, Jonathan had built his reputation as a man who could achieve anything he set his mind to. He had started small, teaching high school history while working part-time at a construction company to make ends meet. But Jonathan wasn't content with scraping by. Over the years, he poured every ounce of his energy into building a real estate business. By his mid-30s, Reynolds Realty was the go-to company for anyone buying or selling property in Maplewood and the surrounding towns. With financial success came a new level of respect, but also new temptations. At the heart of Jonathan's life was his wife, Emily. They had met in college, where her quiet intelligence had drawn him in. Emily was the steady anchor to Jonathan's whirlwind ambition, her calm presence balancing out his high-energy personality. She had been by his side through everything, the lean years, the nights when they worried about making rent, and the times when Jonathan doubted whether he'd ever amount to anything. Emily had given him 3 children. Daniel, their 15-year-old son who shared Jonathan's athletic build and sharp wit. Sophie, their 12-year-old with a passion for art and an old soul that made her seem wise beyond her years. And little Noah, a rambunctious 6-year-old who had inherited his father's boundless energy. Emily was not just a mother and wife. She was a partner in every sense of the word. She had been the one to crunch the numbers late at night when Jonathan was too exhausted to keep going. She managed their home with care, ensuring the children had everything they needed while supporting Jonathan in his ever-growing career. It was Emily who had taken out a loan in her name during the early days of Reynolds Realty, trusting Jonathan's vision when no one else would. She never complained, not even when the sacrifices became personal. But success had a way of changing people. As Jonathan's business flourished, his trips to the city for work became more frequent. New clients, new connections, and networking events seemed to take more of his time, and when he came home, he was often distracted. Emily began noticing subtle changes. The way he dressed a little sharper, the cologne he wore that wasn't the one she had bought him, and how his phone was suddenly always face down on the table. At first, Emily dismissed it. Jonathan had always been a man who thrived on progress, and his growing success came with greater demands. But the distance between them grew. He no longer shared details about his day as he used to, no longer looked at her with the same tenderness. Their once lively dinner conversations turned into quiet meals, punctuated only by the children's chatter. And then there were the late-night phone calls. "Just business," Jonathan would say with a reassuring smile, his tone breezy. "Big deals don't follow a 9 to 5, you know." Emily nodded, but unease settled in her chest like a heavy stone. During one of his business trips to the city, Jonathan met Claire Morgan. She was unlike anyone he had encountered in Maplewood. A marketing consultant with a sharp mind and a striking appearance, Claire had a magnetic energy that drew people in. She was confident and witty, and most of all, she made Jonathan feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. Their initial conversations were strictly professional. Claire had been hired to revamp Reynolds Realty's branding, and she approached the task with a creative flair that impressed Jonathan. But as they worked together, their professional boundaries blurred. Dinners that started as business meetings turned into long, intimate conversations about life, dreams, and frustrations. Claire listened with an intensity that made Jonathan feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. Jonathan began to rationalize his feelings. "It's just harmless fun," he told himself after their first kiss outside a restaurant. Everyone needs a little excitement now and then. But the excitement grew into something deeper. Before long, he was making excuses to stay in the city longer, dreading the thought of returning to the quiet routine of Maplewood. Back home, Emily noticed the changes in him. He was more withdrawn and more irritable. He avoided her questions about his trips, brushing off her concerns with vague answers. She tried to ignore the growing knot in her stomach, tried to tell herself that this was just a phase, that Jonathan was under stress and would come back to her in time. Deep down, she knew. The truth came out on a rainy autumn evening. Jonathan had returned from one of his trips looking weary and distracted. Emily, who had spent the day stewing over his behavior, confronted him as he stepped into the kitchen. "Jonathan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." Jonathan sighed, setting his briefcase down. "Emily, not now. It's been a long day." "No," she said, her voice firmer. "It's always not now. But something's wrong and I deserve to know what it is." Jonathan froze, his back to her. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows filled the silence. He turned around slowly, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice low. "I want you to tell me the truth," Emily replied, her eyes searching his. "You've been distant for months. You're always gone, always distracted when you're here. There's someone else, isn't there?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Jonathan looked away, his silence confirming her worst fears. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. "I knew it," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Who is she?" "It's not what you think," Jonathan began, but Emily cut him off. "Don't lie to me, Jonathan. I've stood by you through everything. I've sacrificed for you, for this family, and this is how you repay me?" Jonathan's frustration boiled over. "Do you think this is easy for me? I've been drowning, Emily, drowning in the pressure, the expectations. Claire, she made me feel alive again, like I wasn't just some machine grinding away for everyone else." "Claire," Emily repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "She has a name. Of course she does." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, his guilt giving way to defensiveness. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did. And honestly, Emily, things between us haven't been the same in years." Emily stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You don't just fall into something like this, Jonathan. You made a choice, and now you've torn this family apart." Jonathan left the house that night, moving into a small apartment in the city. The separation devastated Emily and their children. Daniel, the eldest, was furious and refused to speak to his father. Sophie, ever the sensitive one, withdrew into herself, spending hours in her room sketching. Noah, too young to fully understand, kept asking when Daddy was coming home, breaking Emily's heart a little more each time. Meanwhile, Jonathan's relationship with Claire deepened. They married in a quiet civil ceremony a year later and soon had 2 daughters, Ava and Lily. Jonathan tried to balance his responsibilities between his 2 families, but the strain was evident. His visits to Maplewood became less frequent, and when he did show up, the tension in the air was palpable. For Emily, life was a daily struggle. She returned to work as a nurse, juggling long shifts with raising her children on her own. Her days were filled with exhaustion, but she refused to let the weight of Jonathan's betrayal crush her. Slowly, she rebuilt her life. Emily became a symbol of resilience in Maplewood, a woman who had been abandoned but refused to let it define her. Daniel, angry and bitter over his father's departure, became fiercely protective of his mother and siblings. He threw himself into sports, excelling on the football field, though his anger simmered beneath the surface. Sophie, on the other hand, found solace in her art. Her sketches grew darker, reflecting the pain and confusion she felt but couldn't express. Little Noah clung to his mother, sensing her sadness even if he couldn't fully understand it. Jonathan's life with Claire wasn't the picture-perfect escape he had imagined. At first, their relationship felt like a dream. Claire was vibrant and adventurous, and their daughters, Ava and Lily, brought him moments of joy. But over time, the cracks began to show. Claire had a fiercely independent streak and an ambitious nature that often clashed with Jonathan's need for stability. She wanted to travel, to expand her career, to experience life beyond the quiet suburban existence Jonathan had settled into. Their arguments grew frequent and heated, fueled by Claire's frustrations with Jonathan's divided loyalties and his guilt over his first family. "You're still stuck in Maplewood," Claire snapped during one particularly bitter fight. "Every time you see them, every time you send money, it's like you're trying to live two lives. But you can't, Jonathan. You made your choice." "They're my children," Jonathan shot back. "I can't just abandon them." "Maybe you should have thought about that before walking out on them," Claire said coldly. Her words hit like a slap, but they reflected a growing truth in their marriage. The passion that had once bound them together was fading, replaced by resentment and unmet expectations. Jonathan began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The turning point came when Daniel, now 18, showed up at Jonathan's office unannounced. Jonathan looked up from his desk, startled to see his son standing in the doorway. Daniel had grown taller and broader, his jaw set in a way that reminded Jonathan uncomfortably of himself. "Daniel," Jonathan said, rising from his chair. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Daniel said, his tone clipped. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. Jonathan gestured for him to sit, but Daniel remained standing. "I don't need long," he said. "I just need to know something." Jonathan folded his arms. "Okay, go ahead." "Why?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. "Why did you leave us? Was she worth it? Were they worth it?" Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That he had been selfish? That he thought he deserved more? That he had been chasing something he didn't even understand? "Daniel, it's complicated," he began, but his son cut him off. "No, it's not," Daniel said. "You left. You broke Mom's heart, you shattered our family, and now you're playing house with them like we don't exist. Do you even know what that's done to us? To me? To Sophie? To Noah?" Jonathan felt the weight of his son's words pressing down on him. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but everything he thought to say sounded hollow, even in his own mind. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I never wanted to hurt any of you." "But you did," Daniel said, "and sorry doesn't fix it." Not long after Daniel's confrontation, the fragile balance of Jonathan's second family unraveled. Claire had been keeping secrets of her own, secrets that came to light during a heated argument. In a moment of anger, she admitted that she had been seeing someone else, a colleague from her marketing firm. Jonathan was blindsided. The betrayal cut deep, not only because of Claire's infidelity, but because it forced him to confront his own hypocrisy. He had left his first family for Claire, only to find himself on the receiving end of the same kind of pain he had inflicted on Emily. Claire moved out with Ava and Lily, leaving Jonathan alone in the house they had shared. The silence was deafening. For the first time in years, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. A family emergency forced Jonathan and Emily to cross paths again. Sophie, now 15, had been hospitalized after collapsing at school. Emily had rushed to the hospital, frantic with worry, only to find Jonathan already there. "What are you doing here?" Emily demanded, her voice low but trembling with anger. "She's my daughter too," Jonathan said, his voice heavy with guilt. The two stood in tense silence, the weight of years of pain and resentment hanging between them. When Sophie woke up, she looked at her father with tear-filled eyes. "Why didn't you want us anymore?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. Jonathan's heart shattered. "I did want you," he said, his voice thick. "I never stopped wanting you." Sophie turned away, her tears flowing freely. Jonathan realized then that no amount of apologies could undo the damage he had done. The story ends ambiguously, with Jonathan attempting to reconnect with his children while grappling with the fallout of his choices. Emily, stronger than ever, sets clear boundaries, determined to protect her family from further pain. As for Jonathan, he is left to reflect on the life he tore apart in pursuit of something he thought would make him happy, a pursuit that ultimately left him lonelier than ever. Can some mistakes ever truly be forgiven? And how do we live with the consequences of the choices we make? Let's hear your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for sticking to the end.